Chapter 10. The next evening Arnvid and Olaf agreed to go down to the convent. Arnvid had promised the brothers a gift of wool, and Olaf wished to speak to Brother Vigard about making confession to him one day. It was very dark outside, so they each took a weapon. Olaf had his axe, kinfetch, which he carried whenever he had an opportunity. When they came into the courtyard, they found it was later than they had thought. One of the monks, who had come out to look at the weather, said that the lay brother had already gone to ring the bell for Compline. But Arnvid would like to have a word or two with Brother Helg. Yes, he could find him in the guest room, said the monk. So they went thither. The first they saw on entering were the sons of Kolbein and their cousin Halvard, with 3 other men. They sat on the inner bench, eating and drinking. Brother Helg and another monk stood on the outside, talking and laughing with them. The strangers were already very merry. Olaf stayed by the door, while Arnvid went forward to Brother Helg. At that moment the convent bell began to ring. "Sit down," said Brother Helg, "and taste our ale. It is uncommonly good this time. Then I will ask leave of the prior to go and visit you after service. Sit down meanwhile, Arnvid." "Olaf is with me," whispered Arnvid. He had to repeat it louder a couple of times, for Brother Helg was hard of hearing. When at last he understood, he went up to Olaf and greeted him, bidding him sit down too and drink. And now the sons of Kolbein saw who was with Arnvid. Olaf answered the monk that he would rather go with him to the church and hear the singing, but Haftor, Kolbein's son, called to him, "No, come here, Olaf, and keep us company. We have not seen you since you were our brother-in-law. Come, Arnvid, sit down and drink." As Arnvid seated himself on the outer bench, Olaf put away his axe and threw back his hood. As he came forward to take his seat, Einar clapped his hands together with a smile, such as one gives to little children. "Hey, how big you are grown, boy! Truly you begin to look like a married man already." "Oh, we were all as much married as Olaf, I think, when we were his age," sneered Halvard. Olaf had turned red as fire, but he smiled scornfully. Brother Helg shook his head, but he gave a little laugh. Then he bade them keep the peace. Haftor answered that they would do that sure enough, and the monks went out. Olaf followed them with his eyes, murmuring that after all he was minded to go to church. "Oh no, Olaf," said Einar, "that is discourteous. You must not show so little zeal to make acquaintance with your wife's kinsfolk. Now, let us drink," he said. He took the bowl which the lay brother had placed on the table and drank to Olaf. "That was a heavy thirst you had on you," said Olaf under his breath. Einar was already half drunk. Aloud he said, "Oh, acquainted we are already. And as to drinking to our closer kinship, I think we could as well wait for that till I am agreed with your father." "It must be good enough when father has agreed with the bishop," said Einar, bland as butter, "since he has adopted you. But it is a fine thing to see young people so quick to learn. Do you see now, sometimes it is proper to wait? They say Lord Thorfinn was so eloquent on patience in his Advent preaching. Is that where you learnt your lesson?" "Yes," replied Olaf, "but you know it is a new word to me, therefore I am so afraid I might forget it." "Ha! Be sure I shall remind you," laughed Einar as before. Again Olaf made as though he would rise, but Arnvid pulled him back to the seat. "Is that how you keep your promise to the good brothers?" he said to Einar. In this house we must keep the peace." "No, am I not peaceful? There is no harm in a little jesting among kinsmen." "I did not know that I was among kinsfolk," muttered Arnvid with vexation. "What do you say?" Arnvid did not own kinship with Thor of Hof's offspring by Bjorghild his lehman. But he checked himself, turned his eyes upon the serving men of the sons of Kolbein, and upon the lay brother who was listening inquisitively as he moved about. "There are many here who are not kinsmen." Hafthor Kolbeinsson told his brother to keep his mouth shut. "Though I think we all know Einar, all of us here, and we are used to his teasing ways when he is drunk. But now, Olav, it is time you showed yourself a grown man. If you mean to set yourself up and play the master, it will not do to let yourself be provoked by Einar as when you were a little boy, crying with temper." "Crying?" Olaf puffed with wrath. "I never did so. And, playing the master, I don't think there will be any play in it when I go home and take over my property." "No, that's for sure," said Hafthor quietly. Olaf had a feeling that he had said something foolish. He turned scarlet again. "'Tis the chief manor in that country, Hestviken. 'Tis the biggest farm in all the parish." "Oh, is that so?" said Hafthor, imperturbably serious. "You will have much to answer for, young Olaf, but you will be the man for it, sure enough. You know, brother-in-law, it will be worse with Ingunn, perhaps. Can she cope with a mistress's duties on a great farm like that, do you think?" "We shall find a way. My wife will have no need to drudge," said Olaf proudly. "No, that's sure," said Hafthor as before. "She is coming into great abundance, Ingunn. I can see that." "Oh, that may be saying too much, though Hestviken is no such small place. The shipping and the fishery are the main things." "Oh, is that so?" said Hafthor. "Then you own much shipping too, down there in the Vik?" Olaf said, "I don't know how it is with that. It is so many years since I was at Hestviken. But in old days it was so. And now I mean to take it up again. I have followed Asbjorn Priest here and learnt a lot of ships and trading." "I think you could not possibly want that," said Einar with a smile. "Which such great shipping as we saw you deal with in Ingeborg's goose pond." Olaf rose and left the bench. They had only been making fun of him. Hafthor too. He saw that. That about shipping in the goose pond was a game he had got up for Halvard and John last summer, when the children of Fretterstein were left so much to themselves. "I don't think that I demeaned myself in that," he said hotly. "If I carved some little boats for the children, no one could think I was playing myself." Then he heard how silly and childish this sounded, and stopped suddenly. "No, 'tis true," replied Einar. "That would be a very childish game for a boy who was already grown enough and bold enough to seduce their sister. It was more manly work when you played with Ingunn in the outhouse and got her with child in the barn." "That is a lie," said Olaf furiously. "The thrall's blood shows in you when you use such foul talk of your own kinswoman. I know nothing of a child either, but if it is as you say, you need not be afraid. We shall ask your father to bring it up. We know that it is not to his liking." "Be silent now," said Arnvid. He had jumped up and gone to Olaf's side. "And you, shut up your mouths too," he turned to the others. "Man's work, you said? Do you call it man's work, after Kolbein has accepted atonement, that you sit here snarling like dogs? But you, Olaf, You should have more respect for yourself than to let them egg you on to barking with them." But now the sons of Kolbein and Halvard were on their feet, beside themselves with anger at the last words Olaf had spoken. Kolbein in his young days had freed himself by oath from the fathering of a child, but ill things had been said about the matter at the time, and as the boy grew up to manhood, it was thought he bore an ugly likeness to Kolbein. "Hold your tongue yourself, Arnvid," said Haftor. He was fairly sober. "It is true, your share in this business is such that you had rather it were not talked about. But Olaf must brook it, though I do not begrudge him atonement instead of the reward he deserves. He cannot expect us to embrace him as if he were welcome in our kin." "Nay, welcome to our kin you will never be, my Olaf," sneered Halvard. "Answer for yourselves, not for the kin," said Arnvid. "If that were so, do you think Kolbein would have offered Olaf your sister Bjorkhild to wife instead of Ingunn, Halvard?" "That is a lie," shouted Halvard. "That may be," answered Arnvid, "but he told me that he meant to do so." "Hold your tongue, Arnvid," Einar began again. "We all know of your friendship for Olaf. It will do you no good if we inquire into that. You keep nothing from this minion of yours, not even your own childish kinswoman for his leman." Arnvid leaned threateningly toward the other. "Have a care of your mouth now, Einar." "No, devil take me if I care for a rotten clerk. 'Tis a fine story, I think, this friendship of yours for the lily-white boy. We have heard a tale or two, we have, of the kind of friendship you learn in the schools." Arnvid took Einar by both wrists and twisted them till the other fell on his knees with an oath and a groan of pain and rage. Then Haftor came between them. The Kolbeinsons' housecarls sat on as before, seeming little minded to meddle in the quarrel between the masters. Einar Kolbeinsson got to his feet again and stood rubbing his hands and arms, swearing heartily below his breath. Olaf stood looking from one to the other. He did not understand it quite, but felt as though a hand squeezed at his heart. He had brought Arnvid into a worse slough than he had guessed. They fell upon his friend with grievous insults, flayed him mercilessly. It hurt him to look into Arnvid's face, chiefly because he could not interpret what he saw in it. Then his anger flared up hotly, and all other feelings were burnt up in its flame. Einar found his voice again, now that he had his brother and cousin at his back. He said something. Olaf did not hear the words. Arnvid's face seemed to knit together. Then he drove his fist at Einar and caught him below the chin, so that the man fell backward at full length and crashed against the bench. The lay brother had rushed in amongst the men. He helped Einar Kolbeinsson onto his feet and wiped the blood from him as he shouted to the others, "This is a banning matter, you know that, to break the peace in our house. Is this fitting conduct for nobles?" Arnvid recovered himself and said to Haftor, "Brother Sigvald is right. Now we will go, Olaf and I. That is safest." "Shall we go?" asked Olaf sharply. "It was not us who started the quarrel here." "Let them end it who have kept their wits," said Arnvid curtly. "I shall give Einar his answer in a fitter place. To you, Haftor, I say that I can answer fully for my conduct in this matter. I have answered both the bishop and Kolbein, and you are not concerned in it." "You said you saw nothing of it," said Einar with a grimace. "And that may well be true, if it is, as folks say, that you were a married man yourself for a full year before you guessed what your brother had given you a wife for." Olaf saw Arnvid's face quiver, as when a man has a sudden knock on an open wound. He ran back and snatched his spear, which he had left standing by the door. Seized with insensate rage on the other's behalf, Olaf sprang between them, saw Einar swing an axe in the air, and himself raised kinfetch in both hands. He struck Einar's axe aside so that it rang and flew out of his hands, grazed Halvard, who stood behind him, and fell to the floor. Olaf raised kinfetch once more and struck at Einar Kolbeinsson. Einar ducked to avoid the blow. It caught him on the back below the shoulder blade, and the axe sank in deeply. Einar dropped and lay doubled up on the floor. Now Kolbein's men had come to life. All three staggered out from the bench and thrust at the air with their weapons. But they were very drunken and seemed to have no great heart for a fight, though they yelled bravely. Halvard sat on the bench, holding his wounded leg, rocking to and fro and groaning. Hafthor had drawn his sword and made for the two. It was a rather short weapon, and the others had axe and spear, so at first they only tried to keep Hafthor from coming to close quarters. But soon they found this was as much as they could do. The man was now quite sober and plied his sword with great skill. With a sullen determination to avenge his brother, he took his aim, supple, swift and sure, in every muscle, with senses wide awake. Olaf defended himself, unaccustomed though he was to the use of arms in earnest. But there was a strange, voluptuous excitement in this game, and, in a vague way, he felt acutely impatient every time Arnvid's spear was thrust forward to protect him. Though aware in a way that the door had been opened to the night, he was yet overwhelmed with surprise when the prior and several of the monks rushed in. The whole scene had not lasted many minutes, but Olaf had a feeling of being roused from a long dream when the fight came to an end without his clearly knowing how. It was fairly dark in the parlour now, as the fire on the hearth had burnt low. Olaf looked about him at the band of black and white monks. He passed his hand across his face once, let it drop, and stood leaning on his axe. He was now filled with astonishment that this thing had actually occurred. Someone lighted a candle at the fire and carried it to the bench, where Brother Vigard and another of the friars was busy with Einar. There was still life in him, and the sound came from him like the retching of a drunken man. Olaf heard them say that the bleeding must be mostly within. Brother Vigard gave him such a queer look once. He heard that the prior was speaking to him, asking if it were he who first broke the peace. "Yes, I struck first and cut down Einar Kolbeinsson. But the peace was but frail in here the whole evening, long before I broke it. At the last, Einar used such shameful speech to us that we took to our weapons." "It is true," said the lay brother. He was an old countryman who had entered the convent only lately. "Einar spoke such words that in old days any man would have judged he died an outlaw's death by Olaf's hand." Hafthor was standing by his brother. He turned and said with a cold smile, "Ah, so they will judge the murder in this house, and in the bishop's, since these two are the bishop's men, body and soul. But perhaps the nobles of this land will soon be tired of such dishonour, that every priest who thinks he has authority uses it to shelter the worst brawlers and law-breakers." "That is untrue, Hafthor," said the prior. "We servants of God will not protect any evildoer farther than he has protection in the law. But we are bound to do our best that law-breaking be punished according to law, and not avenged by fresh unlawfulness, which begets fresh vengeance without end." Hafthor said scornfully, "I call them dirty laws, these new laws. The old were better suited to men of honour. But it is true that you are better for such fellows as Olaf there, who outrage the daughters of our best houses and strike down their kinsmen when they call them to account for their misdeeds." The prior shrugged his shoulders. "But now the law is such that the sheriff must take Olaf and hold him prisoner until the matter be brought to judgment. And here we have these men whom I sent for," he said, turning to some men-at-arms, who, Olaf knew, lived in the houses near the church. "Bjarn and Kar, you must bind this young lad and carry him to Audun. He has struck a man a blow that may give him his death." Olaf handed Kinfetch to one of the monks. "You need not bind me," he said sharply to the strange men. "No, lay no hands upon me. I will go with you unforced." "Now you must go out in any case," said the prior. "You can see that we cannot let you stay here. They are coming with Corpus Domini for Einar." Outside it had begun to snow again, and there was much wind. The town had gone to rest more than an hour ago. The little band tramped heavily in the dark through drifts and loose snow between the churchyard wall and the low black timber houses of the canons. Everything looked dreary and lifeless, and the wind howled mournfully about the walls and whistled shrilly in the great ash trees. One of the watch went in front, and then came an old monk who was a stranger to Olaf, but he knew him to be the sub-prior. Then walked Olaf, with a man on each side of him, and one behind, so close that he almost trod on his heels. Olaf's mind was full of the thought that now he was a prisoner, but he was sleepy and strangely blunted and inert. The sheriff's house lay east of the cathedral, but for a long time they had to stand in the drifts hammering on the locked door, while the snow worked through their clothes and turned the whole band white. But at last the door was opened, and a sleepy man with a lantern in his hand came forward and asked what was the matter. Then they were admitted. Olaf had never been inside this gate. He could distinguish nothing in the darkness but driven snow between black walls. The sheriff was away, had ridden out of town about midday in company with the bishop, Olaf heard in a half-dazed way. He was almost asleep as he stood. Reeling with tiredness, he let himself be led into a little house that stood in the yard. It was bitterly cold inside and pitch dark, with no fire on the hearth. In a few moments some men came with a candle and bedclothes, which they threw down upon the bedstead within. They bade him good night, and Olaf replied, half asleep. Then they went out and barred the door, and Olaf was alone, suddenly wide awake. He stood staring at the little flame of the candle. The first thing he felt was a kind of chill. Then his rage boiled up with a defiant, voluptuous joy. So he had paid out that unbearable Einar Kolbeinsson, and God strike him if he regretted it. He didn't care, whatever his hastiness might cost him. Kolbeinen knows how cordially he hated them. Now, for the first time, he saw how he had fallen off in these last months. His dread, his gnawing pains of conscience, all the humiliations he had been exposed to, while he was trying to find a way out of the slough in which he was sunk. It was Kolbein who had barred the way for him wherever he tried to get a firm foothold again. Had not that Kolbein crew stood in his path, he might long ago have been out of all this evil, free and safe, able to forget the painful feeling that he had been a false deceiver. But Kolbein had kept him under his thumb, and now it was avenged, and he thanked God for it with all his heart. It did not matter that Bishop Torvin and all those new friends of his said it was sinful to have such thoughts, a man's flesh and blood were not to be denied. Olaf's mind rose in revolt against all these new doctrines and thoughts he had come under in this place. Ah, yes, they were fine in a way, he saw that even now. But, oh no, they were unnatural, impossible dreams. All men could never be such saints as to consent to submit all their concerns, great and small, to the judgment of their even Christians, always being satisfied with the law and with receiving their rights, never taking them for themselves. He remembered that Hafthor had said something of the same sort this evening, that these new laws were only good for the common people. And he felt at once that he was one with such as Kolbein and his sons, if only in this. He would rather take his case against them into his own hands, set wrong against wrong if need must. His place was among such as Kolbein and Steinfinn and Ingeborg, and Ingunn, who had thrown herself into his arms without a thought of the law, in the warmth of her self-willed love. Not among these priests and monks, whose life was passed in clear and cool regularity, who every day did the same things at the same times, prayed, worked, ate, sang, lay down to sleep and got up again to begin their prayers. And they inquired into the laws, copied them out and discussed their wording, and disagreed among themselves and came into conflict with laymen about the laws, all because they loved this law and dreamt that by its means all folk might be tamed, till no man more would bear arms against his neighbour or take his rights by force, but all would be quiet and willing to listen to our Lord's new and gentle tidings of brotherhood among all God's children. He felt a kind of distant, melancholy affection for all this even now, a respect for the men who thought thus. But he was not able always to bow beneath the law, and the very thought that they would slip these bonds about himself filled him with violent loathing. It added to his rebellious feeling that he was dimly sure they now must look upon him as an outlaw. Bishop Thorfinn could not possibly have any more love for him after the way he had repaid his fatherly kindness, and all the preaching friars had looked on him with such eyes. They must be full of resentment at his defiling their parlour with a man's blood. The old sub-prior had said something about repentance and penance before he went out just now, but Olaf was not in any mood for repentance. It must cost what it might. He ought never to have listened to Arnvid, never come here, never let himself be parted from Ingunn. Ingunn, he thought, and his longing for her came up in him as an incurable torment. She was the only one on earth whom he really knew and was allied to. Ingunn, such as she was and not otherwise, weak and obstinate, short of wit, alluring and tender and warm. She was the only one in the knowledge of whom he was quite secure, the only one of all his possessions that he could take and feel and see and own as something apart from unreal dreams and words and uncertain memories. But she was actually as his own body and his own soul, and now he cried out for her, silently, as he bent double, gnashed his teeth and clenched his hands till the nails ran into the flesh. At the thought of how far he was from her now, and what chance he had now of getting her, all his desire blazed up, so that he moaned aloud and bit his own clenched fists. He would go to her. He would have her now, at once. He was ready to tear her to pieces and eat her up in terror lest anyone should drag them apart. "Ingunn! Ingunn!" he groaned. He must find her, for he must tell her what had happened, find out how she would take it, that he had killed her cousin. Aye, For Einar would die, of that he was sure. There was blood between them now. But, Holy Mary, what could that do when they two were already one flesh? She was not fond of these sons of Kolbein, but kin is kin, and so she would weep and mourn, his poor darling, and yet he could not wish it was undone. And then he must find out whether it were with her as Einar had said. Ah, then she would suffer cruelly indeed. Olaf was shaken by a short, dry sob. Kolbein, who had demanded that she be handed over to him for punishment. But if she fell into his hands, and if she proved with child by his son's slayer, then they would surely torture her to death. He must speak with Arnvid about this. Arnvid would surely seek him out in the morning. Arnvid must get her away to some place where Kolbein could not reach her. The candle was but a thin wick wound about an iron spike. Olaf was not afraid of the dark at most times, but now he dreaded the lights going out and leaving him in the dark with his thoughts. With a cautious hand he trimmed the wick. In a moment he threw off his cloak, his boots, and the fine kirtle and leapt into the bed. He buried himself in the icy cold bedclothes and dug his face into the pillow, moaning for Ingunn. He remembered Christmas night and felt a sort of resentment against Providence. Was this his reward for having done what was right that evening? He drew the skins right over his head, so he would be spared seeing when the light burnt out. But soon he threw them off again, rested his face in his hand, and lay staring at the little flame. Arnvid was the only one he could ask to protect Ingunn, when he could not do so himself. And all at once he had such a strange dislike of the thought of Arnvid. He had not understood what Einar meant by the insults he flung at Arnvid, but so much he saw that Arnvid felt them like a kick on an open wound. And whenever he thought of it, it turned him sick at first, then beside himself with rage. It was as though he had been witness to a nameless piece of brutality. He had gradually become aware that he was very far from knowing Arnvid thoroughly. He relied on him more than on any other person he had met, on his generosity, his loyalty. He knew that Arnvid would fear nothing when it was a question of helping a friend or kinsman. But there was something about Arnvid Finnsson which made him think of a tarn with unfathomable deeps. Or, Asbjorn Olfat had told a story one evening of a learned doctor in the southern lands who wooed a lady, the fairest in that country. At last she made as though he should have his will. She led him secretly into her bower, loosed her clothing, and let him see her breasts. One of them was white and fair, but of the other nothing was left but a putrid sore. The other hearers praised this tale greatly and called it good and instructive. For Raymond, the learned man, turned his heart altogether from the world after this sight, and betook him to a cloister. But Olaf thought it was the most loathsome story he had ever heard, and he lay awake till far into the night and could not get it out of his head. But there was something about Arnvid which made him afraid, that one day he would see something like this in his friend, some hidden sore. But in secret he had always shrunk most painfully at the sight of sickness and suffering, could scarce bring himself to do anyone a hurt. And Olaf had a vague suspicion that it might be the fear of being touched on a sore point that had paralysed Arnvid so strangely in the autumn. Now he came near to wishing that Arnvid had not been so meek, but called him to account earlier. He did not like the thought that he had taken advantage of a man's defencelessness. And here he lay, with the knowledge that he would be forced to ask Arnvid to have a care of Ingunn and protect her, whatever consequences his rash deed might involve, since God alone knew when he would be in a position to do so himself. In a way, Olaf saw something of what ailed Arnvid. Arnvid had never made it a secret that his most heartfelt wish had always been to devote himself to the service of God in holy orders, and after this time he had spent in Hamar, Olaf guessed better than before that a man could wish for that. But he suspected that there were more windings in Arnvid's brain than in Asbjorn Olfat's or Brother Vigard's, for instance. Arnvid longed to submit himself, to obey and to serve, but at the same time he had a sort of fellow feeling with the men who demanded that the other law should hold, the law for men with fleshly hearts, hot blood, and vengeful minds. It was as though at some time Arnvid had been badly crushed between the two laws. It had impressed Olaf that Arnvid never spoke of the years he had been married. From other quarters he had heard this and that about Arnvid's marriage. Tordis, his wife, had first been promised to the eldest of the Finnsons, Magnus, a scapegrace, but of merry disposition, well liked, and a remarkably handsome man. She had certainly been bitterly disappointed with the one she got instead, but there was no doubt Arnvid had had no great love for his wife either. Tordis was proud and quarrelsome. She made no secret of despising her husband because he was so young, quiet-mannered, and rather shy amongst folk. With the mother-in-law she lived in open conflict. Arnvid must have had a joyless youth between these two imperious, quarrelling women. Doubtless it was for that he now seemed to avoid all women, except Ingunn. Of her he was intensely fond, Olaf saw, and this must have been because Ingunn was so weak, had need of men to defend and support her, and had never a thought of ruling over them and giving them orders. Often Arnvid would sit lost in thought, looking at her with such strange sadness as though pitying her. But that was a weakness of Arnvid, that he seemed too much given to pitying, animals for instance. Olaf was kind to animals himself, but the way Arnvid could nurse and tend a sick creature! It was strange, too, how often it mended and thrived when Arnvid took in hand a sick animal. Even his dead wife. The 2 or 3 times Olaf had heard Arnvid speak of her, it struck him that the man felt pity for her. But lately Olaf had felt a growing ill will toward Arnvid for being so ready to show compassion. Olaf knew he was not free from this weakness himself, but now he saw it to be a fault. It might so easily make a man soft and cause him to give way before those who were harder of heart. Olaf sighed, weary and at a loss. It made him so sad to think of all those he had loved, Bishop Thorfinn, Arnvid, Ingunn. But when he called to mind Einar Kolbeinsson and his enemies, he was glad he had done it, in spite of everything. Repent it he could not. But neither could he bear being parted from Ingunn. He had reached an utter deadlock. The candle was almost burnt out. Olaf crept up and carefully wound the last of the wick. He went to the door and scanned it closely. Not that he had any hope of being able to escape, but he felt he must. It was a heavy, solid door, but it did not shut tight. A deal of snow had drifted in. He brought the light. There seemed to be a big lock on the outside and a wooden bar, but there was no part of the lock on the inside, only a withy handle nailed on. Olaf drew his dagger and tried it in the crack of the door. Then he noticed that the key had not been turned in the lock. The door was only bolted with the wooden bar, and he could move that a little with his dagger. Only a little, for the bar was big and heavy, and the blade of his dagger was thin. But he was all on fire. His hands were trembling as he put on his boots and outer garments. He could not give up when once he found he was not locked in. He took his dagger in both hands and tried to force the bolt upward. At the first attempt, the blade broke off in the middle. Olaf clenched his teeth and thrust the rest of the blade into the crack right up to the handle. Then there was not room to work the dagger in the narrow crack. Sweating with excitement, he coaxed it till he found out how far in he could get the dagger, and then to bend it up and lift the bar. Several times he knew he had got it out of the catch, but it fell in again when he let go with one hand to pull the door handle. But at last he did it. The snow burst in on him. He stepped quietly across the threshold and looked out into the night. No sign of dogs. They must have shut them indoors for the weather. Not a sound, but the infinitely fine whistling of dry, powdery snow blown by the wind. Slowly and cautiously, Olaf worked his way in the dark across the unknown courtyard. In a heap of snow by one of the houses stood a number of skis. Olaf chose a pair and went on. The gate to the street was shut, but close beside it a load of timber had been left. From that he could slip over the paling. He began to believe that a miracle was taking place. He climbed the pile and dropped the skis over the fence, heard the soft sound as they fell into the snowdrift outside. "Mother," he thought. "Perhaps it is my mother who is praying for me, that I may get away." It was awkward with his loose cloak and long kirtle, but he succeeded in getting over and dropped into the snow out in the street. He kilted up his kirtle as high as he could with the belt and bound the skis fast to his feet. Then he threw his body forward and set out against the driving snow, which flecked the darkness with streaks of white. As soon as he reached the end of the town, the road was lost in drifts. Only here and there he made out the tops of the fences, now that his eyes were used to the dark. But he kept on, with the snow in his face almost all the time. It was perfectly impossible to distinguish any road marks on a night like this, though he knew the farm where Ingunn was. He had ridden past it many times on the highway in company with Asbjorn, but that would not help him in this weather. He was as good a ski runner as the best, but the going was very heavy. Nevertheless, he was undaunted and toiled on blindly. He was so certain of being helped tonight. It scarcely crossed his mind that he was quite unarmed. The dagger was useless now, and that he had no more than 5 or 6 ducats in money. But he was altogether dauntless. He did not know what time of night it might be, when at last he dragged himself into the yard of the farm where Ingunn lay. Here, indeed, the dogs were awake. A whole pack of them rushed out at him, barking ferociously. He kept them off with a pole he had picked up on the way, and shouted the while. At last someone appeared in the doorway. "Is Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter within? I must speak with her instantly. I am Olav Audunsson, her husband." The short winter day was already sinking, and the grey dusk gathering over the snow-covered land, as 2 sledges with worn-out horses drove into the little farm near Otterstadt church. The 3 fur-clad strangers stood while talking to the master of the house. "Aye, she sits within the room," he said. "Her man is yet in bed, I think. He came hither at early morn, and then they lay and talked in whispers. Our Lord and St. Olaf know what there may be between them, the way they bore themselves. I fell asleep and left them to it." He scratched his head and looked at the three with shrewd inquiry. Asbjorn Priest he knew well, and the others were Arnvid Finson from Mickelboe, the woman's kinsman, who had been here more than once and spoken with her, and his old henchman. The three strode into the room. Ingunn was sitting on the step below the farther bed. She held some sewing work in her lap, but it was too dark for her to sew in that corner. She rose at once on seeing who had come and went toward them, tall and slender in her black gown, pale and dark-eyed under her woman's coif. "Hush!" she bade them in a low voice. "Go quietly. Olaf is asleep." "Ah, then it is time you woke him, little woman," said Asbjorn Priest. "Too much wit I never thought the boy was burdened with, but this is worse than the worst. Can he not guess they will search for him here first of all? And here he lies asleep." The priest chortled in his rage. Ingunn posted herself in the men's way. "What do you want with Olaf?" "We wish him no ill," said Arnvid, "but the way he has marred everything. You must come with me now, Ingunn, and stay with me at Mickelboe, for you can guess that now the Lord Thorfinn can hardly refuse to give you back to your kinsfolk." "And what of Olaf?" she asked as before. The priest gave a despairing groan. "Is it not the very mischief that he should fly straight here? She there will never keep a close mouth with what she hears." "Oh, yes, she will, for she sees it is for Olaf's good. Ingunn, you must know that this priest here and I too, we run no small risk in concealing a homicide and helping him to get away." "I shall know how to hold my peace," said Ingunn seriously. She stepped aside and went up to the bed, where she stood for a moment, looking at the sleeper like a mother who has not the heart to wake her child. The priest thought, "Ah, yes, she is fair after all." It seemed to him that these women for whom young boys committed folly and sin were seldom such that a sober and sapient man could see anything goodly in them, and for this one here he had uncommonly little liking. This Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter had the look of a slothful, loose-minded woman, feeble and cosseted, useful for nothing but to make trouble and strife among men. But now he thought, perchance she was better after all than he had thought. She might even make a good wife when she grew older and steadier of mind. In any case, she had conducted herself like a person of sense, and she looked on her friend as though she loved him faithfully. And fair she was. He had to admit they were right who said so. Olaf looked very young and innocent as he lay asleep with his white, muscular arms under his neck and his fair hair spread over the brown woolen pillow. He slept as soundly as a child. But the moment Ingunn took hold of his shoulder and woke him, he started up, wide awake, drew up his feet and sat on the bed with his arms clasping his knees as he looked calmly at the two men. "Have you come hither to fetch me?" "Arnvid has come to take your wife home with him." "I?" The priest looked round at the others. "I think you must let me speak with Olaf alone first." Arnvid took Ingunn by the hand and led her to a seat at the farther end of the room. Asbjorn Allfat sat down on the bed beside Olaf. Olaf asked earnestly, "What does Lord Thorfinn say to this? An ill chance is it that I should repay his hospitality so badly." "You never spoke a truer word, and therefore you must now see that you betake yourself further, out of the land." "Shall I fly out of the land?" asked Olaf slowly. "Uncondemned? Does Lord Thorfinn say I must do this?" "No, I say it. Einar is dead. The bishop and the sheriff can scarce have heard of the slaying yet. We don't look to see them home before tomorrow. And I made Audun's folk understand that since they could not hold you better, they ought to keep Kolbein ignorant of your flight till the sheriff himself could tell him. They are out searching for you now, but with this heavy going they cannot come so far out as this, and now it will soon be night. Whatever happens, we must venture it in God's name. We stay here till the moon is up, a little after midnight. 'Tis clearing up outside and freezing. Old Guttorm will go with you and show the way. Swift ski runners such as you are should reach Solberga by the end of the 3rd day. There you must stay with my sister no longer than is necessary and keep in hiding till Sven Bergson finds you a lodging somewhere in the neighbourhood. But can this be wise, to fly the country before I have been condemned to it? Since you have taken wings, you must fly on, said the priest. Will you have folks say of you that you broke out of prison merely to come hither and fondle your wife? Don't look at me so madly because I'm saying this to you. You are young and bull-headed, and little thought have you beyond your own affairs. Such is the nature of your age. And maybe you have not thought that a man like Lord Thorfinn may have many matters on hand of greater moment than that you should enjoy your Ingunn and her goods in peace. And you came with this suit of yours at an inconvenient time. You could have hardly chosen a worse time to trouble the bishop with your concerns. Aye, it was Arnvid's counsel, not mine, Olaf interrupted. Oh, Arnvid, he is as ill-timed as you when it is a question of this frail wisp of a woman. But as I told you, Olaf, we must now order it so that the bishop shall not have to deal with this case of manslaughter too. Here your kinsmen must come forward, and it will be their affair to obtain leave for your return, so that you may buy your peace in the land of Norway's king. I wonder, said Olaf, pondering. I don't think Bishop Thorfinn will like it that I go off in this way. No, he won't, said the priest curtly, and it is for that I will have you do it. These new men who rule the realm for our little king are making ready for open war against Holy Church, and the Lord Thorfinn must have his hands free of such suits as yours. Had you been shut up in Mjø's castle, he would have leapt into the saddle for your sake, because you have sought his help, and because you have few friends, and the Lord Thorfinn is so saintly and a true holy father to all the fatherless. And withal he is obstinate and headstrong as a he-goat. That is his chief fault. But I expect you to understand this. You have sought his protection once, and you were given it, and after that you disgraced yourself, as you have done. It would not be very manly of you to ask more of him now, knowing that you add to his difficulties thereby. Olaf nodded in silence. He stood up and began to dress. It will be more difficult for us now, he said quietly, for Ingunn and me to be brought together. At the last, I think her kinsman will tire of having to keep her when she is neither rightly married nor unmarried, said the priest. But you two can surely wait a few years now. Olaf contracted his brows, looking straight before him. That we have promised each other last night. We shall keep the troth we plighted to each other, and I shall come back to her, alive or dead. That was an ungodly promise, said Asbjorn dryly. But it is as I thought. It is an easy matter, Olaf, to be a good Christian so long as God asks no more of you than to hear sweet singing in church, and to yield him obedience while he caresses you with the hand of a father. But a man's faith is put to the test on the day God's will is not his. But now I will tell you what Bishop Thorfinn said to me one day. It was of you and your suit we were speaking. God grant, he said, that he may learn to understand in time, that whoso is minded to do as he himself wills, will soon enough see the day when he will find that he has done that which he had never willed. Olaf looked earnestly before him. Then he nodded. That is true. I know it. They took some food, and a while after they lay down in their clothes, all but Arnvid. He offered to watch. He sat beside the hearth, reading softly from a book which he had brought in his travelling wallet. Now and again he went out of doors to see the time. It had cleared now, and the stars sparkled densely over the whole vault of heaven. It was freezing hard. Once he knelt down and prayed with his arms stretched out in the form of a cross. At last he saw that the light of the rising moon was growing over the top of the ridge. He turned and went in to the bed where Olaf and Ingunn slept together, cheek to cheek. He roused the man. Now it is time that you were gone. Olaf opened his eyes, gently freed himself from the woman's arms, and at once got out of bed. He was fully clad, all but his boots and outer garment. He now drew on his footgear and a coat of reindeer skin. Arnvid had provided clothing more suited to a long journey on skis than the kirtle and the red cordwain boots, which had suffered badly on the night before. This Guttorm of mine knows his way everywhere about here on both sides of the border, said Arnvid. This was Arnvid's old henchman, his foster father, he might be called, who was to act as guide for Olaf. Arnvid handed Olaf his own sword, a spear and a purse of money. We will say that you have sold me your horse Elk. You know I have always wished he was mine. So be it. That foul talk Einar came out with, muttered Arnvid hesitatingly as he looked down into the fire. He was always ill-natured and a liar, and a lecherous goat himself, and never guessed that other men may turn sick at what he... Olaf cast down his eyes, mortally embarrassed. He understood not a word. I was fain you should have Ingunn, for I believed you would be good to her. Will you swear, Olaf, never to desert my kinswoman? Yes. And I may rely that you will hold your hand over her? If I did not know I could feel safe leaving her in your care, I would never in this world do as Asbjorn says and fly to Sweden. But I know you are fond of her. Ha! I am! Arnvid burst out laughing. He struggled against it but could not stop. He trembled with suppressed giggling till the tears ran down his cheeks. At last he sat doubled up and laughed till he shook, with his arms on his knees and his head buried in them. Olaf stood by, profoundly uncomfortable. Now you and Guttorm must be gone. Arnvid pulled himself together, wiped the tears of laughter from his face, and stood up. He went and called the three others. Olaf and old Guttorm stood out in the yard, with their skis bound fast to their feet, well armed and furnished with all they required. The three others stood before the door of the house as Ingunn went up to Olaf and gave him her hand. He shook it hard, and they spoke together a few words in low tones. She was calm and altogether self-possessed. The waning moon had soared up into the sky high enough to cast long, uncertain shadows across the heaped-up drifts of the snowfield. In the forest, the going will be fine, I think, the priest encouraged them. Olav turned and glided back to his two friends who stood at the door. He shook hands with them too and thanked them handsomely for their help. Then he faced about. Steinfinnsons and Asbjorn stood watching the two, Olav Audunsson and his guide, as they glided over the long stretch of fields toward the forest with powerful dogged strokes. Then they passed into the shadow at the edge of the woods. "Laos Dio," said the priest. "So ill is it that this is the best. I was afraid Ingunn would break out into a fit, shriek and howl at the last minute." "Oh no," said Arnvid. He looked up at the moon with a strangely frolicsome smile. "It is only in trifles that she takes on like that. When serious matters are at stake, she is as good as gold." "Do you say so? Well, you should know her better than I," said the priest unconcernedly. "Now it is we two, Arnvid. This may prove a dear jest for us, that we have helped Olav Audunsson to get away." "Yes, but there was no other way." "No." The priest shook his head. "But I wonder whether Olav has any notion that you and I have risked much by helping him in this." "Have you lost your wits?" said Arnvid, and the waves of laughter heaved up in him again. "You surely know he has no notion of what anything costs at his age." Asbjorn Allfat gave a little laugh. Then he yawned. And then the three, the priest, the other man and the woman, went in and lay down again.